Okay, well, firstly, thank you so much for asking me to do this. The Aeneid is one of my absolute passions. As Irene was saying there, I have taught for a staggering 18 years, and I don't quite know how that's happened, but it has. And literally every one of those years, I have taught the Aeneid. It was actually an epic that was first introduced to me when I was 16. So it's something that I hold quite close to my heart. So I'm just going to start with fundamentally what the epic is about. And then obviously my main focus is to focus upon all the many, many female characters that we actually do have within the epic. And gosh, there's a lot. I'm going to try my best to talk about all of them because I think they deserve some justice. So, the Aeneid fundamentally is an epic that extols the virtues of Augustus and his regime. It was written for that, commissioned by Augustus himself. So we have these kind of key episodes within it where Augustus appears in quite glorified terms. And alongside that, of course, we have Aeneas, our protagonist, who's this man who has to leave Troy because it falls to the Greeks. And then he has this mission where he has to reach Italy and will lay the foundations for what will one day become Rome. And he's like this developing Roman hero throughout the entire epic. So gradually he sort of incorporates these Roman values, which the Roman audience would have really upheld and what obviously Augustus was trying to implement further within his reforms. So this idea of piety and gravitas, a sense of self-control and fides, all those kind of mos maiorum qualities that the Roman world was built upon. But the epic is so much, much more than that. It is an epic that delves into, it's quite a deep psychological epic on some levels. It explores pain and grief and suffering in quite a huge amount of detail. Whether Virgil sort of gives us an idea, a way out of suffering is another question, but he certainly, leaves us thinking about it and how this is actually a really strong component in our lives. And also, he explores gender, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So we have this kind of, in some ways, we have this kind of stereotyping going on. So we have the stereotype of the female. And then we have the stereotype of the male, which I'll get into in a little bit in a second. But I don't think that ultimately that's his message. I think really he's saying that we're fundamentally human, and as we're human, we all have our flaws, and that's genderless. It doesn't necessarily mean that women are worse than men, and so on. He's actually fundamentally saying we all have our flaws, and really that's what we need to challenge, and that's what we need to do in order to become better people. And I think really ultimately that's what we get out of the end of the epic. So let's just think about the stereotype just for a second. And with that, I'm just going to talk quite generally about how women were viewed, not just in Virgilian poetry, but just in sort of classical literature, just generally. So the female obviously has a stereotype of being emotional. Yeah, yeah. So I think, unfortunately, that's nowadays we still do that. We still think about the woman being driven by her emotions. And as a result of that, she becomes irrational. She also is, in some respects, quite lascivious as well. So, particularly in the Roman world, there was this kind of sort of tendency to view the woman in it's quite an over sexualized sort of person. And as a result of that, that kind of lustful desire made the men sort of more wary of the woman and making sure that she was kind of kept within the kind of home and what have you, and not let out because if she did, she could challenge my bloodline if she, sort of slept around and so forth. So we do have this very heavy stereotyping going on in Roman literature. And when they do talk about this kind of prostitute image of the female, it actually does get a little bit grotesque in some places. So they talk about sort of sexual secretions, for example, and that actually does come up in Virgil's Aeneid in a little subtle way. So he is buying into the stereotype a little bit in some instances, which does sound a little bit disturbing, but he's just doing really what other people were doing at the time within the literature more generally. So that's generally how we view the female within classical literature. She's if you give her some independence, the result is going to be quite catastrophic. And that's the message. Whereas the stereotype of the male is obviously juxtaposed to that. He is the leader of the state. So therefore, he's much more level-headed. He has this sense of gravitas, this sense of self-control, and he's driven by those values that make society work. Yeah. So He has a sense of justice about him, and so forth. So we have this kind of sort of almost, gender power play going on here. One can rule the state and the other cannot. And obviously that this is anything new in the Roman literature. We see it in the Greek world as well. So if you pick up texts like Euripides' Medea, for example, obviously we have a classic case, don't we, of the female getting out of control. So by the end, she's done the ultimate act, hasn't she, of committing filicide and therefore disrupting the patriarchal line. How horrific and awful. This is what happens when you give a woman a sense of power. She'll go wild with it. So that sense of stereotyping is certainly nothing new, and it was picked up even more within the Roman literature, and particularly in Augustan literature, because after all, this is an epic that is written for a patriarchal audience. So it has that kind of patriarchal line sort of running through the narrative. But that's the surface interpretation. It is my belief that Virgil certainly challenges that in certain characters. And I will be talking about how that is challenged and ultimately really what he's saying about human beings generally and not just about the woman. So let me just get into it. So firstly, I'm going to share a PowerPoint just to go through some images for you. I'm going to talk just about who the female characters actually are. So I'll go through pretty much as many as I possibly can, and I'll explain who they are, where they sort of appear, and so forth. And then we'll talk about the stereotyping of them, and then I'll talk about how that stereotype is sort of challenged. So let me just get it up here. Okay. First off, I'm just going to talk about the deities, the two domineering deities that we have within the epic. So here you've got two Pompeian images of them, actually, wall paintings of them. You've got Juno on the left, who has this sort of gold crown on her head, and she's kind of veiled. And then on the right, we have Venus, who looks a little bit more lascivious here, which kind of ties into who she's actually the goddess of. She was the goddess of passion and desire and so forth. Whereas Juno is kind of the goddess of marriage. So you've got you can see just between the images here, how the Romans were kind of viewed them within their culture. One was a little bit more lascivious and lustful. The other one was a sort of emblem of sort of marriage and virtuosity, if you like, but not quite in the literature. So Juno is an absolute dominant character within the Aeneid. She really dominates the narrative from the very beginning to the absolute end, but she dominates it in quite catastrophic ways. She is the absolute embodiment of furor, which is this very negative characteristic of rage, passion, and anger, which juxtaposes the pietas, duty, or the gravitas, the self-control that the Roman world was meant to adopt and exhibit, particularly from a male perspective. So Juno is our personification of rage and anger and passion. We are told at the beginning of the epic why she is driven in this way. Two of the reasons that are provided to us are actually quite superficial from our perspective. It kind of buys into the stereotype of the woman being driven by petty jealousy and vanity. But the other reason carries a little bit more weight because it's tied up with her sort of city of Carthage and that she's obviously the patroness of. Every single time, though, Juno appears in the narrative, she does, though, with implosive impact. And it often involves a tempest, or it might involve fire, or in one very memorable scene in Book 7, it involves her actually calling upon Alecto, the chthonic fury, to fire up Turnus, the opposition to Aeneas, to incite war. So every time she appears, it results in some kind of catastrophe. So you can see that with Juno's character, it's certainly buying into the stereotype of the female as being someone that will cause destruction and war even. And in fact, a lot of females in the Aeneid are tied up with war and the beginning of war. And just from what I've just mentioned there, you've got Alecto too, that's kind of seen as the inceptor of war as well. So she is incredibly important for us for the kind of stereotyping aspect. She's also quite a meddling goddess as well. She intervenes, particularly in her interactions with Venus as well. So again, you're buying into that stereotype of the female being meddling and quite manipulative by nature and so forth. I'll move on to Venus now. So Venus is she kind of dominates the narrative in the first quarter of the epic, and she sort of appears a little bit towards the end. Again, when gets herself involved, she buys into the stereotype of being quite meddling. And when she does so, again, it has catastrophic outcomes. She is the mother of Aeneas. So, in that respect, her involvement in the narrative is purely done from a maternal perspective that she obviously wants to protect him. And we do have a lot of that going on with our female characters. They're there to sort of act in a familial role to protect, as we would expect, for example, the father to sort of protect his son, which is another thing that the Roman world is built upon, this kind of father-son interaction and so on. So really, is it really any different to what the female is doing? Not so much. But when the female does get involved, it does end with some kind of disaster. So, for example, with Venus, she takes it upon herself to make Dido fall desperately in love with Aeneas. And she does this through quite manipulative ways. She gets, for example, her other son Cupid to take the form of Ascanius, Aeneas' son, so that when he is sitting upon Dido's knee, he shoots an arrow into her chest, and she falls helplessly in love with Aeneas. But unfortunately, this love turns into a major infatuation, so much so that she becomes the embodiment herself of furor by the end of book four, and she takes her own life. So it has catastrophic outcome. So definitely, again, buying into this narrative of the women being meddling and so forth. When Venus intervenes a bit later, it's not so catastrophic in the sense that she gets armor made by her husband Vulcan for Aeneas to sort of aid him on the battlefield. And then she helps again in book 12 when he's got a wound in his thigh, and she gets him better. So again, just acting more of a more maternal sense there. Okay, so other females, this is more on a human plane now. So we have Dido, who's also a wall painting here from Pompeii on the left. It was a very popular epic, this. It was everywhere. It was in everyone's houses, It was very much of the day, if you like. So let's talk a little bit about Dido. Everyone really empathizes with Dido because obviously she's seen as a pawn used by our deities that I've just mentioned. There's a little bit more to it than that, though. I mean, certainly you've got a kind of sense of it in this image here, because if I just go back to our Venus, is in a rather lascivious pose there, isn't she? Half naked, really emphasizing that sense of lust. You got it here with Dido, haven't you? She looks quite lascivious herself there. And unfortunately, Dido does fall into that stereotype. And a lot of people forget that. When she becomes infatuated with Aeneas, it brings out all the negative female characteristics that the Roman world would have been very much aware of. This idea of lust and desire and, sexual appetite that women were kind of tied up with, which was an anathema to them, because if a woman was like that, oh my goodness, my bloodline's going to be severed because she could have a child with somebody else. So unfortunately, Dido does go down that path. And rumor, the sort of avian female monster, spreads that kind of sort of idea about her through the tribes surrounding Libya. And they get this idea, oh my goodness me, this is a lustful woman. What is she doing walking around Carthage with this man? So unfortunately, Dido does fall into that trap. But nonetheless, though, we can't help but empathize with Dido's situation. After all, she's driven to it by Venus's intervention. She's then driven to believe that she's actually in some kind of solid union with Dido with Aeneas, to the point where, of course, she believes he's going to be with her forever. And then he says, sorry, I'm leaving now. And of course, she spirals completely into heavy emotion at that point, which ultimately leads to her suicide. And her death is incredibly poignant, not least because she's killed herself before her allotted time, which actually prevents her from entering the underworld. And Juno has to take pity on her at that moment, and a lock of hair is sort of taken from her and given as an offering to enable her to get in. And that's why she appears as a shade in book six in the underworld. We have to obviously empathize with her outcome, but also Vergil plays with us because he does put her into the stereotype, not least with the kind of sense of the lascivious character of her, but in the things that she says as well. She says some pretty horrific things to Aeneas in the agonistic debate. But actually, when he is about to leave her shores, she puts the curse upon him, of course, which is the outcome of the Punic Wars historically. So here we have another female tied up with the inception of war. She says some other things as well. She actually talks about cannibalism and killing Ascanius and feeding his flesh to Aeneas. I mean, that would have been horrific. I mean, it's horrific to us now, but to a Roman audience, oh, here we go. We've got a woman who's going to kill a son. No, this is bad. So she unfortunately does get put into that stereotypical category. Then, of course, on the right-hand side, we have the opposite, don't we? We have Creusa. So Creusa is Aeneas's wife who obediently follows him as he leaves Troy. And she unfortunately gets lost amongst the chaos and she gets killed by the Greeks. Here you've got the kind of iconic image, haven't you, of Aeneas leaving Troy. He's here with his, you've got past, present, and future, haven't you? So you've got his father on his shoulders and his future, which is his son by his side. This image would have been sort of branded around the Roman world at the time. This is what you need to live up to, this sense of patriarchy. And you've got the obedient wife following behind him, which is kind of the image of what they would expected of the female figure. Be obedient, follow the husband, and so forth. So again, buying into that sense of the stereotype of how the woman needs to be. However, when he goes back to seek her and find her, she comes to him as a ghost. And she is the first to give a sense of where he needs to go. So she tells him to head towards the west, Hesperia, as it's mentioned in the Latin. The first actually time where he's actually been told where he actually needs to head. No one has actually told him, you've got this mission, but no one's told him where he needs to go. But it actually comes through the mouth of Creusa. She then says that, unfortunately, my death is a necessity because you need to marry someone of native blood when you get to the new homeland. So in a sense, she's sacrificed herself for the mission to be successful. So here we've got the woman tied up with this sense of suffering. And that's where we get this concept of exploring suffering and what suffering actually means. And here we've got it, completely linked to the female. And actually, unfortunately, a lot of females do suffer for the sake of the mission to be successful. But it's not just females, though, I might add. It's also the men as well, because that stereotype is challenged. Okay, so some more minor figures now. We have got the Sibyl in the top left-hand corner. We've got Lavinia in the bottom left-hand corner. We've got Juturna in the top right. We have Iris, who's kind of in blue there. And then we've got our monstrous females, which are some of my favourites. We've got the Harpies and we have the Furies. So minor, yes, but actually quite significant, some of these. The Sibyl has to be mentioned as challenging the stereotype because she is the ultimate guide for Aeneas to perform his catabasis. If it was not for the Sibyl, he would not have been able to have coped with the topography of the underworld. She is his ultimate guide through it. And this is because Hecate has shown her all the parts and therefore she knows everywhere where to go. So not only does she guide him through it, but she also tells him specifically what he needs in order to be successful with this mission, which is the golden bough. You need this. This is your golden ticket to get into the underworld. This is sacred bough, which no one has been able to get, but she knows that Aeneas can get it because he's pious and so forth. She then convinces the ferryman, who's very hostile towards him, to get him on the boat. So without her, he wouldn't have been able to have done that. And then she uses sleep-induced drugs to actually drug Cerberus, this kind of ferocious three-headed dog, which we're all familiar with, to get past him. She guides him past the fields of mourning, past Tartarus, and then she gets into the Elysian fields where he sees his father. He couldn't have done it without her. He needs her. This is the ultimate guide. So, definitely challenging the kind of narrative here of the woman being not helpful and needs to be on the sidelines and not a leader. She does everything that is absolutely essential for him to perform this very important catabasis. And I suppose in some ways she kind of mirrors Circe in some respects, because Circe in sort of book 10 and in book 12, could he have really, set off and been successful in getting past those sea monsters if it wasn't for her? Because she guides him exactly what to do with regard to Scylla. Go towards her, you'll lose less of your men, and towards Charybdis, that will suck you down and drown you all. She gives him that. everyone forgets that she gives him that advice. It doesn't come from Tiresias, who actually is pretty useless with his advice in when he sees him as a ghost. So actually, Circe is vital, just as the Sibyl is, and definitely, Virgil's playing upon that here within this narrative. I mean, Lavinia, I'll mention briefly. I mean, yeah, whenever I teach this, I always get, well, Lavinia's the perfect woman, isn't she? Because she's seen but not heard. That's what the Romans want. As I say, I'm going to challenge that stereotype in a second. So I don't really think that is ultimately what Virgil is saying here about these females. Yes, she doesn't. She is in the background, and he does eventually end up marrying her, which is what is needed for him to solidify the alliance to settle in Italy and so forth. Again, she does fall into the stereotype in the sense that in some ways she is a starter of the war, is she not? Because she's initially betrothed to Turnus, but when Latinus sees Aeneas arrive on his shores, he recalls a prophecy that was told to him many years ago that his daughter was destined to marry a foreigner. So when he sees Aeneas, he's like, "Oh, that must be the prophecy I heard. Sorry, Turnus, you're not going to marry Lavinia anymore." And he's like, "What?" And obviously that incites him into sort of being very hostile to Aeneas. So again, you've got this kind of very common trope, haven't you, in the classical world of the woman starting war. Herodotus mentions it at the beginning of his histories, doesn't he? Oh, the abduction of women, that's what all starts it. It's always the woman's fault. So he does kind of play upon that kind of narrative. We've got Juturna. Juturna is Aeneas's, sorry, Juturna is Turnus's sister. And again, we've got this kind of concept of a familial member wanting to help another familial member from being harmed. So Juturna gets involved around book 10 into book 12 to try and prevent Turnus from being harmed by Aeneas. She's spurred on to do this by Juno's intervention, but Juturna's figure mirrors that of Anna in book 4. So Anna is the sister of Dido who desperately tries to help her sister in her situation. She does encourage her to go with Aeneas, but only because she can see that as a good match for her at the time, as any sister would say to another sister. So Juturna mirrors that. She's desperately just trying to help Turnus, as you would expect. Unfortunately, she's quite an empathetic. She's very minor, but she's empathetic. We hear that she was ravaged by Jupiter, and then he makes her immortal, and actually that's her curse. Because when she learns that she can do nothing for Turnus, she has to live with all eternity with that, oh my goodness, I couldn't help my brother, and I'm going to witness his death, and she has to live with that forever. And we have this very sad speech from her actually in book 12, where she says these words, and her words are actually not too dissimilar to what Anna says when she holds Dido's dead body in her arms. I wish I could have done more. And it's very, very similar in the way they speak. We have Iris here as well. So Iris is used as she's basically the female counterpart to Mercury, and she's used by Juno to do her bidding. So we have her sort of stirring up the Trojan females at the end of book 5 to set fire to the ships and so on. And I just want to talk a little bit more about the monstrosity that we have here, though. We've got the Furies, we've got the Harpies, and we also have Dira there, who's the female bird in the top right-hand image that comes along and frightens Turnus in book 12. Female monstrosity is quite big in the Aeneid. It's bigger than male monstrosity. Hardly get any male monsters mentioned at all. They're mentioned very briefly in passing, not our female monsters. This is definitely Virgil tapping into the stereotype with these. So the Harpies appear in book 3, and they are utterly hideous. They're rapacious. They are sort of leaky and smelly as well because they befoul the food that Aeneas has made on the island of the Strophiades. But it's definitely tapping into a view here of women being leaky, smelly, polluting creatures. This idea of our menses were viewed in the classical world as something quite disgusting. I mean, Columella tells us that our menstrual blood could be used as an insecticide. That's how quite revolting it was to a male perspective. So here we have these female monsters that are almost like the physical manifestation of everything that is vile of the female. They look hideous, they smell, they pollute. And if you look at the Latin really carefully, he uses the noun venter, which means womb. And the befoulment comes from that. And there is a general belief now in the world of the scholars that they're actually menstruating over the food. and therefore he's buying into this kind of imagery of the female being polluting and leaky and quite revolting. So here we've got a physical manifestation of that within this kind of monstrous female. So he's kind of tapping into that, as does other Augustan writers. There, you get it in Horace, and you do get it in Ovid as well. It was quite a common trope to use at this time, and the Furies kind of tied up with that. So the Furies, by their very nature of their names, are obviously the physical embodiment of rage, anger, but they physically manifest it in quite grotesque terms because they're pale and they're quite forlorn looking. And it's quite interesting that when Dido becomes increasingly mad towards the end of book four, she becomes pale and forlorn too, which kind of mirrors what the Furies look like. So they're almost like the physical manifestation of what fury does to your body. It literally wastes you away. And the Furies obviously do quite bellicose things within the Aeneid. You know, they start, well, you've got Alecto starting war, for example, in book seven. You've got Tisiphone in book six, who guards the entrance to Tartarus, and she enjoys using her whips and her snakes upon those that come and enter Tartarus. You know, she enjoys tormenting them. So they're pretty nasty female monsters. The Dido that doesn't get spoken about an awful lot is another avian monstrous female in book 12. She's sent down by Jupiter. She's used by Jupiter to create plague and pestilence. And she morphs herself into a bird to flap and shriek and into people's faces and create fear and harm. So here again, we've got this kind of stereotype of the female sort of being, you know, in a physical manifestation of being quite, bellicose and grotesque and creating harm and what have you. So that's mentioned in book 12 as well. And they're all kind of interlinked, these sort of female avian monsters, and very much buying into that sense of the stereotype. Okay, so we do have minor, very, very minor ones as well. We've got Cassandra, we've got Helen, mentioned in book two. Helen, when Helen's mentioned very briefly, but when Helen is mentioned in book two, Aeneas sees her and he instantly compares her to a Fury. So there you got the connection, because Helen, of course, is seen as the woman who started the Trojan War. So when he sees her, his instinct is, oh, look at this Fury. He says, he wants to kill her. Yeah, that's his instinct, because he sees her as a reasoning for why the city is falling. And that's how she's mentioned in book two. We also get a reference to her in book six as well, because we learn that she's the reasoning behind Deiphobus, who ends up getting mutilated by Menelaus. So she was married to Deiphobus, and then she lures Menelaus when he comes out of the horse, you know, to sort of get into the palace, and basically he slices and dices his nose and his ears. It's quite grotesque. So she's the reason for that. So again, we've got this buying into the stereotype of how the woman can create catastrophe and harm and so forth. Cassandra is a victim of war. We have this really, it's only mentioned in one line actually, but very moving scene where she's kind of taken away by the Greeks and her hands are sort of bound and she's dragged away. So she kind of represents the kind of imagery of war. And I must say, war is very unpleasantly described in the Aeneid. It is. It's very much an anti-war poem. So we get lots of references to how catastrophic war is. And that is no coincidence, given that Virgil has lived through civil wars throughout the late Republic. He doesn't want that to be repeated. So, you know, the way he describes conflict and the bringing down of cities like we have, for example, in book two, would have been quite close to his heart. I know I've kind of briefly mentioned in relation to Juturna, we're meant to see them as one and the same. It's kind of sisters sort of helping their sort of sibling. Rumour is another female avian monster. She's the one that kind of spreads the rumour about Dido being quite lascivious by nature, you know, in the way she's acting with Aeneas. She's described as being a horrible monster with eyes, loads of eyes underneath her wings, because she sees things, and then she has all these kind of tongues that spread these terrible rumours, and of course just happens to be female, because of course passing on gossip is something that females stereotypically do. Amata. So Amata is Latinus's wife. She really likes Turnus. She wants her daughter to marry Turnus. So obviously when Aeneas comes along and Latinus chooses him, she's utterly, utterly incensed by this. But then she's fired up even more with that sort of anger by the intervention of Alecto, who throws a sort of snake around her neck and it seeps into her breast. and it turns her into a Bacchant figure. So here we have this wonderful image of this Bacchant crazed woman. That's why I put the Bacchant there, because or Minor, she runs through the streets in this frenzied way, and then she takes Lavinia and goes and hides in the woods to keep her away from Aeneas. Bacchant imagery, of course, is an anathema to the Romans. The Bacchanalia was outlawed in 186 BC. So to them, the Bacchanalia and the Bacchants that were involved in it were a symbol of frenzy and out of control and irrational behavior. So it's quite interesting that, he specifically uses the simile, not just in relation to a martyr, but he does it with Dido as well. Dido is a Bacchant figure towards the end of book 4. So very much sort of tying into the imagery of the woman being irrational and out of control. Camilla. So Camilla is the challenge to the stereotype in 100% ways. So she is our warrior, our very brave warrior. I often have people say to me, he doesn't do enough with her. She dies too soon in book 11 and so forth. But we have to remember that Camilla is actually a very minor character. She appears very briefly at the end of book 7 as part of the warriors that are following Turnus and his Rutilians. And then she appears at the end of book 11, leading up to her death. But she's minor, yes. But Virgil dedicates quite a lot of pages to her in book 11 to describe not only her background, we actually learn everything about her, where she's come from, how she's become like this kind of devotee to Dido and to Diana. And then she really goes into great depth about her death as well, which he doesn't do for quite a lot of the males. He might mention where, who their father is and who their sons are and what have you. But with this woman, he wants us to admire her. And actually, he uses his authorial voice to draw us into the narrative, to actually be with this woman as it leads towards her death. So we shouldn't really see it as the fact that he hasn't really given her enough time. He does quite remarkably well with her. So we learn, for example, that she's the daughter of Metabus. He's a king. He's driven from his throne, and he gets to this river. At this moment, she's only an infant. So he prays to Diana to save his infant child, and he ties her to a spear, and he throws the spear to the other side of the riverbank. And Diana guides the spear to safety. And then he swims across and he raises her as a warrior in the woods. And she becomes this devotee to Diana. So we learn this really quite in-depth background to this woman. And then in book 11, she's wounded by arrows. She gets this spear in her breast, which is a fatal blow. And unlike any of the men, I might add, she stays on her horse, holding her reins while her life is ebbing away in a very stoic and brave manner as she addresses her maidens that are following her. No other man does that. When a man gets wounded in the Aeneid, their face falls flat into the dirt, and that's it. But not her. She falls strong. She holds strong on her reins to the bitter end. So I think that's quite unique that he does that, and he's definitely challenging the stereotype there. He's definitely saying there at the moment, a woman can be as good as a man, if not better. She can be a stoic warrior. She can really stand her ground, which is really quite something. Remember, this is written for a male audience ultimately. So for him to do that is really quite unique. I mean, there are other arguments who say, well, she's more masculine and she therefore fits in more of the patriarchal line of the entire epic. But I disagree with that. I really think he's definitely saying something here about the woman and how brave a woman can actually be. And we mustn't forget as well that we do have that with Dido. Dido is a really good ruler at the beginning of the epic. I mean, she's building a city, for goodness sake, she's building a city and she's got the people admiring her. She's dispensing law and order. She's doing everything that you would expect of a male leader in the ancient world. So he is challenging the stereotype there. He's definitely saying that women can be, very, very strong. So yeah, I mean, as far as the female stereotype is concerned, as I say, there's a sense of being emotional, irrational, bellicose, leaky and smelly. Yeah, he does tap into this idea of the kind of menses and sexual secretions, which I know is quite grotesque, but yeah, that's what they spoke about. They spoke about it from Hippocrates and onwards. And they're lascivious. And I suppose, as we would say about Lord Byron, yeah, he's mad, bad, and dangerous to know. There is this kind of general concept that the female was mad, bad, and dangerous to know, or what was the line by Rudyard Kipling? The female of the species is more deadly than the male. Yeah, so he's definitely sort of tapping into that stereotype that that's exactly what the woman can do, and it makes sense for him to do that because obviously that was generally what you see in classical literature, okay, of the female. We all can agree with that. Um, so first, I'm just going to sort of pick out some quotes actually from the epic now where we do see that stereotype. So poor old Dido does get the brunt of it. So she, as I was saying, she is compared to this Bacchant image. Like a Bacchant, stirred by the shaking emblems and roused to frenzy. I mean, in that moment, we can't help but imagine this lady can we just running through the streets being crazed her and also her rolling eyes as well is a kind of physical sort of manifestation of madness, and that's how unfortunately she is physically described to us when Aeneas says that he's leaving. And then we have this wonderful simile, which on one level is referring to Aeneas, but on the other level is referring to Dido, but also her sister. So we have Aeneas is compared to this sort of oak tree. So just as the north winds of the Alps vie with one another to uproot the mighty oak, blowing upon it from this side and that. So we have this imagery of Aeneas sort of firm in his sort of decision to leave Carthage. The oak imagery was quite commonplace in Augustan literature to represent sort of gravitas and self-control and so on. And this oak tree has been buffeted by these sort of tempestuous winds, and obviously the winds, represent sort of the pleas of Dido and Anna to sort of remain in Carthage. In that moment, we're meant to take this simile as a perfect example of, Aeneas's sort of stoicism. He's not given in to his desires to sort of stay with her. He's putting his people first and so forth. And then we have this wonderful line by Mercury. So Mercury has to come down to tell Aeneas, you got to go. You got to get your skates on, just get out of here. And he says, women are unstable creatures. They're always changing. I mean, that could be more stereotypical if you tried. So, I mean, definitely a misogynistic line, undoubtedly, but buying into that kind of narrative that we are uncontrollable. We change from one day to the next. We're irrational. And actually, I have to say, at this moment, and Dido is kind of talking in her sort of bed chamber, sort of saying, "I'm going to get the fire torches and I'm going to set fire to all of his ships." So she is saying quite irrational things. And actually, the last one here is the bit that I was touching upon earlier. She does say something that is quite grotesque, particularly for us, but even for a Roman audience. Could I not have put his men to the sword and Ascanius too, and served his flesh at his father's table? I mean, buying into this idea that the woman can destroy the bloodline, she can take a son and kill it, as we have with Medea, for example, committing filicide in Medea. He's playing into that, isn't he? Because undoubtedly, Euripides' Medea would have been a source for him for this. He's also drawing upon the representation of Medea in Apollonius' Argonautica as well, who she was also quite crazed in that too. So, yeah, I mean, the idea of cannibalism there, it is quite a horrific thing to say. So unfortunately, Dido is definitely sort of placed into this category of the stereotype. But of course, there are other factors to this, isn't there? There's the intervention that has driven her to this point. Even Aeneas himself, he doesn't think about her emotions, her feelings. When he talks to her in their agonistic debate, he's just so cold. And he even says to her, well, if I had my way, really, I probably would have stayed in Troy. And he actually does say that. And she's like, so you wouldn't have stayed here anyway? And he's like, well, no, not really. And of course, that just spurs her on even more to be quite incensed by him, because remember, at this point, she is totally infatuated with him. So he doesn't really help the situation either. So there are lots of factors that are contributing to her downfall, even obviously herself and her madness. She lets it get the better of her. Okay, so obviously we've got some other sort of stereotyping, haven't we? The one that I was mentioning earlier about Helen. So she's compared to a fury. So this Helen, so this fury sent to be the scourge of Troy and of her native Greece. So, this idea of the fury imagery here and the fact that obviously Helen's the starter of war and so forth. And then that leads me into the harpies here, who are referred to as the vilest of all monsters. So we got the superlative there to show that they're the worst of everything, and they're feminine, of course. Um, and then the idea about their kind of leakiness is mentioned. Now, actually, these quotes, I must say, are from the David West translation. The reason why I've took them from here is because I teach David West more than any of the other translations. But there are many translations of the Aeneid, of course. The way that this is done is a little bit anachronistic, because if you look at the Latin, it doesn't really come out like this. But I'll read what he says here about the harpies anyway. A fearful clanging of their wings, tearing the food to pieces and polluting everything with their foul contagion. The stench was rank, and through all this we heard their hideous screeching, leaving behind them the half-eaten food and their filthy droppings. It's the droppings bit that irritates me, because in the Latin it uses vestigia, which literally just means traces, can even mean footsteps. Now, it's been interpreted in many ways by other translators. Debbie Felton, for example, argues that it is menstrual blood because their contagion comes from the renter, the womb. So that's why she argues quite convincingly, I might add, that he's touching upon this idea of the polluting being the menses, which was a very, really common concept in the classical world. So here we've got, the physical manifestation of the grotesqueness of the female being played out here. And then, of course, we have our Fury. So we've got Alecto, the bringer of grief from the infernal darkness. Dear to her heart were the horrors of war, anger, trickery, and treachery. Yeah, I mean, there you go. You've got a definition there of furor, haven't you, and rage and passion and so forth. And then the moment when she kind of spurs on a martyr, she throws a snake on her breast to enter deep into her heart, a horror driving her to frenzy and bringing her whole house to ruin. So it's this idea that the woman does that, you see. So if the woman does do something that is unstable and irrational, it will bring down the reputation of the household. And that's why, from a misogynistic point of view, women had to be kept well within her place. And then the last one, then this is Dyra I've given you here because she's often overlooked. So this is the female monstrosity that morphs into a bird. So she took in an instant the shape of a little bird, which perches on tombs on the gables of empty houses. In this guise, the monster flew again and again at Turnus's face, screeching and beating his shield with her wings. So again, this female avian monstrosity is such a common theme in Vergil's Aeneid, and every one of those female avian monsters do the same thing. They create some form of catastrophe. Okay, so now that's the stereotype. It is challenged by Vergil. It isn't just the fact that, oh my goodness me, the females are just so driven by furor and rage, and it really is much, much more than that. Not least because we see those characteristics in the men as well. And Aeneas, more than any others, Aeneas himself is lascivious. He's driven by lust and desire in Book 4. We must not forget that. And ultimately, he is the embodiment of furor at the very end of that epic. So much so that actually Michael Putnam has said he becomes Juno himself, whereas Juno actually shows clemency in giving up her anger completely and allowing the Trojans to be successful. She shows clemency. Aeneas does not. So the epic ends with a twist in the narrative, with Aeneas embodying everything that the female had. So there's something being said here in the way that Vergil is challenging it. So with regard to the challenging of it, obviously we do have some strong dominant females. We see it in the likes of obviously Camilla, but also Dido. Dido herself is incredibly stoic and wonderful at the beginning of the epic. And I mentioned there about Clementia in relation to Juno. And of course, we have this idea of the female being an important guide, such as, for example, with the Sibyl. So just to clarify this, I've just given you some quotes here that kind of show it. Now, Dido is an amazing woman at the beginning of the Aeneid. She's in a man's world and she's a queen. She's looked up to by her people. She's building a city for them, just what Aeneas has to do. And that's why he's so in awe of her. In fact, when he's entering Carthage and he sees everyone sort of building, building the city, he looks at it in absolute awe. And we have this wonderful sort of simile where they're compared to bees working together to get this all done for her because they really admire her so much. And she's very much like Aeneas in that she's a refugee herself. She's come from Tyre. She was driven out of Tyre, which was her original homeland, by her sort of wicked brother Pygmalion, who had killed her husband, so she has to leave. Like Aeneas, she takes her sort of refugees and then she makes her way to North Africa and she builds this city for them. So she's a wonderful sort of example of what Aeneas needs to become. And she's compared to Diana, which is obviously this really strong, independent sort of deity that we have in the pantheon. In fact, twice she's compared to her in book one and in book four. And then, of course, it all goes horribly wrong because of the terrible intervention that she has by outside factors. So at the beginning, it reminds me sometimes of what Odysseus says to Penelope in the Odyssey. He compares her to a king. You're like a king, he says. Yeah, and I think that to me really shows that these writers are sort of saying, yeah, we have the stereotype of these women, but we mustn't forget that these women are quite able. They can do as good a job as a man, if not better than a man. And that's definitely what we have of her. So in the example I've sort of given you here, she is compared to Diana. So she was like Diana, and like Diana, she bore herself joyfully among her people, urging on their work for the kingdom that was to be. She was giving laws or rules of conduct to her people and dividing the work that had to be done in equal parts by allocating by lot. So she's acting as you would expect of a leader to act. Incredibly admirable. And then, of course, I've given you a quote here relating to the Sibyl, because as I was saying, the Sibyl isn't the ultimate guide for him. Without her, he would not have done that Catabasis. So she tells him to get the golden bough, which you've got here. And then we have Juno, who does show her clemency. Her clementia at the end, she gives up her anger and allows we get this reconciliation basically. And there's lots of debate that Virgil should have ended the epic there because after all you've got reconciliation on a divine plane. What a perfect place to end it, but he doesn't. Instead he ends it quite dramatically, quite abruptly, with this sort of death of Turnus when he's in supplication, where at that moment Aeneas should have shown that clear clementia. And yes, I know there's lots of debate about whether Virgil was going to write more. There's now the general consensus is that it was deliberately done. It was deliberately finished at that moment. All he wanted to do was actually revise what he had written, but then unfortunately he died before he could do that. The whole burning of the thing again is anecdotal. We just don't know if that is true. But he deliberately ends the epic with Aeneas doing that for quite to make quite a point, which I'll get into. So obviously Juno here says, I, Juno, yield and quit these battles which I so detest. When at least they come together and peace and make their laws and treaties together, do not command the Latins to change their ancient name. In other words, she says, I have one stipulation. Please don't let them be called Trojans anymore. Let the Latins keep their name. And actually, that's quite significant because in a way, it's given the Romans their sense of identity. They want to be seen as being Italians after all. They want to be seen as having the kind of, the Latin tongue, which is what Jupiter obviously grants them after Juno speaks. So it gives them a sense of identity and gives them that connection ultimately to, to Italian soil, if you like. So the stereotype is challenged. It's definitely challenged. So I think my point is that we have fural, we have lascivious behavior in the male as well as in the female. Women can be as strong as the male. It's almost like that kind of yin and yang sort of idea, isn't it? That there's a little bit of the female in the male and there's a little bit of male in the female and so on. I think ultimately what his point here is the idea of what furor does. Furor is not something that is necessarily driven by the woman. It is also driven by the male as well. He's definitely getting us to sort of question that as a human flaw, just generally, and how that human flaw can topple societies. It can create war and catastrophe and so on. And there's definitely that message right at the end there regarding that very negative characteristic. And remember, he's lived through this. He's seen people driven by rage and anger in the latter half of the Republic. He's seen what that does. So I think ultimately that's what he's getting us to think about here. It's quite a deep psychological notion, really. It's not just, here's one gender and here's the other, and one's better than the worst, and worse than the other. It's not that. They share those same qualities. I mean, Aeneas is just horrific towards the end. If you read book 10 really carefully, he's literally he uses the verb harvesting. He's harvesting down people as if he's cutting down corn, without any care for the lives that he's taking. And I think that's quite telling there, because it's really showing that he at that moment is just as bad, if not worse, than what Dido becomes, or any of the other females that embody that sense of fuel. And at least Juno has the ability to show what she's meant to show at the end, which is mercy, which Aeneas does not, which is quite telling, isn't it? I stop share. Okay, I think I just rambled on there, but anyway, I hope that was of interest.
Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording now and then we can just take questions and have a conversation. Thank you again, Alexis. That was been very thorough.